Thank you for coming tonight to think about the Apostle Paul and his journeys, where he went, his life. And this could take up countless hours and weeks, and we're going to try to get most of it in within about an hour and try to reflect on a few things. And that'll be fun. Just to give you just a kind of basics of the timeline, you know, Jesus is born, because they couldn't count years later on, probably around 4 BC. Paul's probably born about the same time. We don't have a date for that. Jesus was crucified probably about the year 30. Pentecost, birth of the church. A few years after this, Paul has his conversion. We'll talk about that in a few moments. He travels all over the world between 46 and 58. Finally, he's imprisoned in Rome about 60, dies some number of years after that, but we don't really know. Maybe 4 years, maybe 8 years. Chronology is a little bit elusive on this. The amazing thing about this is you can get a map and you can plot where all Paul traveled. Paul traveled about 10,000 miles. Now, a lot of you have probably traveled 10,000 miles in your life. You've not done it, though, on foot over rocky, unpaved, difficult roads, and you haven't taken the kind of just ship travel in the ancient world. It's not a mystery why constantly you hear about shipwreck, right? There's shipwreck, and it's because they had shipwreck all the time. Or ships would be in the water, and the wind wouldn't blow the right way, and they would just sit there for days. And you can imagine disease in the ancient world, quality of food. You got an infection, you die. I mean, it's a difficult world. Paul traveled over 10,000 miles. That's pretty amazing. He wrote a lot of stuff. And if you think about it, about half the books of the New Testament have something to do with Paul. They're either about Paul or Paul wrote them. It's pretty amazing. He had no idea he was writing books of the New Testament, right? He was like worried about the Christians in Ephesus, so he wrote them a letter. And here we're reading it all this time later. That's pretty interesting. Tomorrow, this is actually interesting. Tomorrow, James Tabor, who teaches at UNC Charlotte, is going to be with our, what do we call them, Barbara? Adults Plus, right? I was going to say older adults, but that would just sound worse than it is. And James, he's a good friend, and we traveled together. In fact, we were in Israel together with a group in Jerusalem a number of years ago. And it was kind of funny. People would have a question, they'd say, James, so we'd both answer. And he has written a book that's like a lot of other books now about Paul. And it's called Paul and Jesus. And his thesis, this is sort of in the line of books that you see all over the place. These are the bestsellers in bookstores and religion today. These are books that trash traditional Christianity. And they're big sellers. They make a lot of money, which says something about the American public that we shudder to ponder, right? And so his thesis is that Jesus was really cool, and Paul totally messed him up and misunderstood him and created a religion that Jesus would have despised. And so I'm going to talk with James about this tomorrow. If Jesus was nothing but a guy and a really clever teacher, then James is right. Actually, because Paul created something that assumed that Jesus was more than just a guy and a very clever teacher, right? So anyway, we'll talk about that tomorrow. But that's a line of thought that's interesting. Paul is born in Tarsus. This is one of those, like, you know, Google satellite shots. It's kind of cool, right? It's Tarsus. Tarsus was a pretty interesting place in those days. It was a real center of education. It was a trading center. You can understand why, right? It's sort of at the cusp between continents there. There's a lot of trade that went on. Paul and his family, they were tradesmen. You know, hear about Paul being a tent maker. They would have dealt in all kinds of canvas products. They would have been moderately wealthy people. And you have to remember, the ancient world, however the pyramid works in our world today, the pyramid in the ancient world was far skinnier and steeper, right? So you can imagine a pyramid sort of like this. So moderately wealthy might be there, right? And then you have the emperor and people like that up there. We don't know what Paul looked like. This is an amazing thing. About 100 years after Paul's death, somebody... that's not Paul. Somebody in a book called The Acts of Paul, it's one of those apocryphal books that came about 100 years after the Bible, described what Paul looked like in this book. They don't know, but it said he was a man of small stature with a bald head and crooked legs, which made me think of Gollum, of course. In a good state of body, with eyebrows meeting and a nose somewhat hooked. Never mind. He's Jewish, right? Why is that not funny? Hooked nose. Full of friendliness. Now I love this. Now he appeared like a man, and now he had the face of an angel. We don't know what Paul looked like. We know that as a young man, he studied with a rabbi named Gamaliel, who was one of the great rabbis of the first century. Very noteworthy. Gamaliel actually appears a number of times in the Bible. For instance, in Acts chapter 5, there's this amazing passage that I would commend to you to read later. It's a long passage. The disciples are in trouble because they have said, they've been asked to renounce Christ, and they say, we must obey God rather than men. So they're in an act of civil disobedience, and they're in some trouble. And so everybody's stirring up Gamaliel as the leader of the Jews there to condemn them. And Gamaliel says this amazing thing where he says, let's leave them alone. He says, if this plan is of men, it will fail. But if it is of God, you will not be able to overthrow them. You might even be found to be opposing God. And that's amazing, right, for someone to say? Because when Jesus is crucified, of course, it's the Jewish leaders who get in cahoots with the Romans and say, we have to get rid of this man. One of the interesting things is that there's a Paul scholar named Charles Quarles, Q-U-A-R-L-E-S. He's written a really lovely book on the life of Paul, and it's got photos and maps and all kinds of cool things. If you want to learn a lot about Paul, it's an excellent book. Charles Quarles believes that Paul was present when Gamaliel said this very open-minded thing about the Christians, and he was incensed by that. And so therefore he had a break with his teacher, whom he admired and loved so much for, because what he had learned from Gamaliel is to be super Jewish, if you will, right? I mean, Paul brags about these things in Galatians 1. He says, I was advanced in Judaism beyond all of my peers. Like, Paul's such a modest guy, right? Because you have people that they're very diligent about keeping the Torah, but Paul, he was advanced above all the others, right? And in Philippians 3, he says, I was blameless with regard to the law. Well, that's a pretty serious boast, right? So Paul's always talking about, he's very earnest about the law. And here Gamaliel is giving a bit of room to these Christians who aren't great Jewish law-abiding people. And so he's incensed. And so then the next thing that happens in the story is you have the stoning of Stephen, right? Stephen's persecuted. One of the things that's clear is that Paul is present at the stoning of Stephen. Paul himself is a persecutor of the early Christians, right? And you have to think about why. Why were Jews... See, there was every good possibility for a number of years that Jews and Christians could have coexisted peacefully. And a lot of people have written about that and have said that we missed a great opportunity in history because they could have lived together. They could have been fine. There actually were other Jewish groups in those days who said so-and-so is the Messiah, and war didn't break out over this. If Bill Livingston said, if it said that Cliff Hemingway is the Messiah, I might think, he's a little bit deluded. I mean, it's like saying, I'm a Carolina fan or something. It's okay. So a lot of people thought somebody was the Messiah. So the split wasn't because the Christians said that Jesus was the Messiah. It wound up being over other things like, like dietary laws. At first, the Christians thought we need to be Jewish to be Christian, but then they were trying to reach Gentiles. They stopped obeying the dietary laws, circumcision, and so on. And this is very difficult, right? Because what you do with the body is something that really matters. It's a real source of division. We're finding this in our own day. What are Christians willing to split up over? And it's stuff like what you do with your body, right? Homosexuality or whatever, right? So these body issues really loom large always. So Paul is a persecutor of Christianity. He takes off on the road to Damascus, and I wish this photo had turned out better. This is a photo I took of the road to Damascus. You can go up in the northeastern edge of Israel, and you can look over into Syria and Lebanon. You can see the road that heads to Damascus. Paul is somewhere along this road, and something that's narrated a number of times by him, but especially in Acts chapter 9, he tells that, let me just read a little bit of it. Anybody know this story? Okay, Acts chapter 9, let me just read a few verses of this. And his Hebrew name is Saul, his Greek Roman name is Paul, so it's not like when he was converted that he became Paul. He always had both those names. Saul, still breathing threats and murder, I mean, he's seriously against the Christians, against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked for him letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so if he found any belonging to the Way, that's sort of the early name for Christianity, I like that, the Way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now, as he journeyed, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven flashed about him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? He said, who are you, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. And then Jesus, speaking to him, sends him back into the city. And we could talk a long time about, what is this? Like, what happened. What Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 is that there were people who saw the risen Jesus, and that was Peter and Thomas and all the disciples and a big crowd of people. There were a bunch of them saw Jesus after his resurrection. And he said, and I also saw the risen Jesus. It's fascinating. And it's this personal meeting that changes Paul from being a persecutor of the Christians to their biggest advocate. And that's, I'm going to ask James Tabor about that tomorrow, right? If Paul took Jesus and said, oh, I'm going to create a religion out of this, how did he move from being a hater of the Christians to their advocate? And it was this personal meeting on this road that really brought this about. So, of course, if you know this, Paul goes to Damascus, and a man named Ananias cares for him. Ananias is scared of him at first, but the Lord tells him, it's really interesting, actually, what the Lord tells him. Ananias says to God, I've heard he's harmed many Jews, but God said to him, go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings and the sons of Israel, for I will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name. That's so interesting, isn't it? Right? We tend to think, I'll tell you about Jesus and you'll learn how cool that will be for you, right? Or I'll tell you about Jesus and he'll help you succeed. Or I'll tell you about Jesus and he'll make you healthy, wealthy, and wise. But here it's, tell him about Jesus because I need him to know how much he will, suffer for my sake. And Paul does, in fact, suffer for his sake. All this happens in modern Damascus, which is very hard to visit these days because Syria is just one of the saddest places on planet Earth, isn't it, with all that's going on there. So then Paul goes back to Tarsus for a while, and then really mysteriously, this doesn't appear in the book of Acts, Paul says in the book of Galatians that he went to Arabia for 3 years. Like, where's that? And we don't know what that means, but in those days, by Arabia, they meant sort of anything east and south of Palestine, of the Holy Land. And one of the theories is that he went to a place called Petra. Some of you have been to Petra with me. It's in the country of Jordan. It's one of the new wonders of the world, right? And there was a whole civilization, the Nabatean civilization, that went there. And Paul's there for 3 years. And what happened, we have no idea. But we can imagine that Paul was doing what he did everywhere that he went. Is he's trying to tell people about his meeting with Jesus and what he'd learned from the apostles. He's really young at it at this point. So you wonder, like how good is he just yet, right? Like we have Parker Haynes with us tonight, our young preacher. He's really good for being young, right? But we say for being young. I'm kidding. Paul's young. Like how good was he at it? But he's got this zeal. He's got this passion. So then he goes to Antioch, which is one of the largest cities in the world, and it's the northern part of the Middle East there. And he spends a long time in Antioch, and he learns a lot about Christianity. And then, I'm having to abbreviate so many things. He embarks on what's called his first missionary journey, which is narrated in Acts chapters 13 and 14. I couldn't find really a great map that was easy to see in this kind of room. But you can see over here on the right, Syria. There are two Antiochs. There's an Antioch that is in Turkey today called Pisidian Antioch. Paul begins in Syrian Antioch. And he leaves there, and he goes by ship, and he comes up and he visits these cities through the central part of what today is Turkey, and in those days would have been Asia Minor. And it's really interesting, the things that happen during this time. First, he goes to Salamis in Cyprus. This is the home of Barnabas, who's one of Paul's fellow travelers. It's always what's interesting is we always think of Paul going somewhere, but he's always with somebody, isn't he? He's with Barnabas, he's with Mark, he's with Timothy, he's with Silas. He has these fellow travelers. Barnabas is from Cyprus. They stop off at Barnabas' home. Did Barnabas' mother cook for them? You always wonder these kinds of things. And then they go to Paphos, which is the port, and then they land in Turkey at the port of Perga. And our group going to Turkey will be going there, and we'll see this is the ancient city gate from Perga from Roman times. Paul would have walked right through that gate. And he travels far to the north to Pisidian Antioch. Last time I took a group from Turkey there, we arrived on a day like this. It was 16 degrees and very windy. And it was cold. But again, you have to think about Paul traveling in this kind of weather and these kinds of elements. We were on a bus. Paul would have traveled all of this on foot, right? Exposed to the elements. Pretty gutsy stuff. And he goes to Antioch, and pretty interesting. In Acts chapter 13, he preaches a sermon that begins, men of Israel, the God who made the people of Israel chose our fathers. If you're talking like that, who are you talking to? You're talking, it's a Jewish audience, right? He keeps referring to the scriptures of the Old Testament. When he speaks to a Gentile audience, of course, he can't do this. They've never heard of Abraham or the Torah or any of this. So a lot of what Paul says, you can parse it out by what his language is like. The funniest incident in this missionary journey comes when they come to Lystra. And this is just, I think the first Christians had to laugh when they heard this story. It says, now at Lystra there was a man sitting who could not use his feet. He was a cripple from birth. He had never walked. He listened to Paul speaking, and Paul, I love this, looking intently at him. It's amazing how often in the Bible, when there's a healing or something, it's prefaced by saying, like, he looked at him, right? Like you want to be healed, but you want to be seen. You want to be known. You want to be noticed. A lot of times people ask you, what do you do when there are beggars that you run into on the street? And I always think it's not a bad thing to look at them. Like, no, they're a human being, right? So you notice the humanity in the other person. He looked intently at him, and seeing that he had faith to be made well, said in a loud voice, stand upright on your feet. He sprang up and walked. Like, amazing. When the crowd saw that what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in Lycaonian, I wonder what that language is like, the gods have come down to us in the likeness of men. Well, it's ironic, isn't it? Because Paul's message is God did come down in the likeness of a man, but right, that's not Paul, right? And then they say, Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul, because he was the chief speaker, they called Hermes, right? So they're thinking, it's like it's Zeus and Hermes have come. And the priests of Zeus, who assembled in front of the city, brought oxen and garlands and wanted to offer sacrifice with the people. You can just imagine the ruckus. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of it, they tore their garments, rushed outside among the multitude, crying, why are you doing this? We are also men of like nature with you. We just bring you good news that you turn aside from these vain things to a living God. It's pretty important that Christianity was not born where you had people who had no religion at all and then they got religion, like they didn't believe in God and then they started believing in God. They had loads of religion. They had plenty of religion. And it's actually interesting, the idea of there being a new God being introduced in the Roman world would not have been shocking to anyone. Because if you ask the average Roman on the street, how many gods are there? Like in America today, people would know to say, like, one, right? But in the ancient world, people would have said, lots. The question is, whose temple do I go to? What sacrifices do I make? Where do I pay my offerings and so on? So the idea of one more God wouldn't have been a problem. The peculiarity about Christianity is that Christianity alone rolled into town and said, this is the true religion and the others are false. And that caused a huge stir and some consternation for reasons that we'll see. So they continue on this journey, traveling through, I'm cognizant of Parker's got to get to the Carolina game at 8, so I'm going to keep moving along here. The first journey ends, and Paul comes to Antalya. This photo I took there a number of years ago. It's a big port city. You can't see the water in this photo. It's not a great shot, is it? And they get back on the boat, and Paul finds his way back to Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem, an amazing thing happens, because you're already having a split in early Christianity between those who think Jesus was Jewish, their first disciples were Jewish, Mary was Jewish, Paul was Jewish. Jesus didn't say, I came to abolish the law, but I came to fulfill the law. So you have a group of early Christians that say you have to become Jewish, you have to be Jewish, you have to do these things. And then the people like Paul who are saying the law is good, the law instructs us, the law shows us how we're sinful, the law is good for the Jews, but to reach the Gentiles, that's not going to work. So they have a big debate in Acts chapter 15. It's sort of the first big church council ever. And it says that the apostles and elders gathered to consider this matter. Do we go to the Gentiles or not? And after much debate, I love this. They had a long debate, and we do this in United Methodism now. We have debates over whatever the issue is. The main one today is homosexuality. And the way you would finish that sentence today is we have our big council, and after much debate, it's sort of everyone goes home mad. Right? Is pretty much what happens. That's sort of the nature of debate. In this case, everybody went home with a strategy for how to reach people, right? So they sort of make a deal. They say to the party of James, who is the brother of Jesus. This is a photo of James, by the way. It's a painting by El Greco of James, the brother of Jesus. who's sort of the leader of the Jerusalem, we need to be Jewish Christian movement. They say, go to the Jews, tell them about Jesus. We're going to go to the Gentiles. We're going to tell them about Jesus, tell them they don't have to be circumcised, they can eat pork, whatever. So they sort of agree to a deal over this. Now, James Tabor would say that James and Paul would have loathed one another. But I have a friend who's a scholar over in Great Britain, teaches at St. Andrews. His name's Richard Balcom. He's like maybe the smartest human being that I know. He wrote a book on this. And I love just sort of his summary statement. He said, between James and Paul, there would have been much nodding of heads and smiling agreement, as well as some knitting of brows and some exclamations of surprise. I mean, that's just got to be right. Paul makes his way all the way back home, and then he embarks on his second missionary journey, which is pretty interesting. What he does, if you think about it on the map, Antioch again, and he retraces his steps through Asia Minor. He revisits the church that he had founded a couple of years before. This is pretty interesting. So he founds a church, but he's not done with them. He keeps coming back to them. He writes letters to them later on. He stays in contact. He's aware that they're young, they're fledgling, they need a lot of help. And then the amazing thing is he makes his way to the west coast of Turkey, to the west coast of Asia Minor, and then a really surprising thing happens. In Acts chapter 15 it says, they went through Phrygia and Galatia. This is something to ponder in the Bible. It says, having been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word in Asia. Like you tend to think the Holy Spirit would forbid you, I don't know, stealing, pillaging, arson, right? The Spirit would prevent you from terrible things. But here it's saying the Spirit's preventing them from something that's actually good, speaking the word in Asia. And that seems to be the Spirit has a particular calling for them, not just generally doing good. And I wonder about that for us. Is God to call you just generally to do good, or is God have something specific that God calls you to? When he came opposite Mysia, they attempted to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus did not allow them. Like this is like closed doors, right? So they went down to Troas. And a vision appeared to Paul in the night. A man of Macedonia, and this is in Europe. Christianity has never been to Europe before. A man of Macedonia was beseeching him, saying, come over to Macedonia and help us. This is why all over, when you drive out in country roads, you see, the Macedonia Baptist Church, right? Come over to Macedonia and help us. When we had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go into Macedonia, concluding God had called us to preach the gospel to them. That's kind of cool. So then you hear about the court. So they go to Troas, which is the port, and it says, this seems like nothing to us. Setting sail from Troas, we made a direct voyage to Samothrace, and the following day to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi. And you and I, we hear that's just like, what? In the ancient world, if people heard those words, they would have said, you are kidding. Normally, this is a journey that would take 10 days. The winds are unpredictable. The tides are unpredictable. It's just a journey you just slammed in a week or two to try to get from Troas to Neapolis, and they make it in 2 days, which is like the minimum possible time. So sort of hint, hint, in the ancient world, people would have thought, like, God's making this thing happen. Like, the journey was better than it could conceivably have been. This is a photo of Troas. You may pick up from the word Troas, ancient Troy, the Battle of Troy. Is there in western Turkey. So this is the port near where Troy was. Paul leaves from here on this journey. And they go to Samothrace, and they make that 150-mile journey in 2 days, which is amazing. When they land in Neapolis, they walk up this Roman road called the Via Ignatia. The Romans did terrible things for people, but they built roads, right? There weren't good roads before them. The Romans were wonders, and you can still see a lot of those Roman roads to this day. And they come to Philippi, and this is just one of the great stories in the Bible, I think. I just want to read a little bit of it. They arrive in Philippi, and here's the beginning of the story in Acts chapter 16. We remained in the city of Philippi for some days. On the Sabbath day, we went outside the gate to the riverside, and that photo on the right is the river that goes by Philippi. And those stones in the photo date back to Roman times. So you're kind of around where Paul would have been, right? So they go down to the riverside where we suppose there was a place of prayer. We sat down and spoke to the women who had come together. I mean, what does that tell you? Like, well, I don't know if that's a charitable view or not. Women had come together like no guys had shown up, right? a phenomenon in early Christianity, it's by far a female-driven movement. Women come around far quicker. This is probably true in 2015, right? Women come around quicker. But the women had come together. One who heard us was a woman named Lydia from the city of Thyatira, a seller of purple goods. And that's a clue in the ancient world, purple goods. So that's what's an expensive store in Charlotte? Montaldo's or something, right? The purple goods. And she was a worshiper of God. This is really interesting. She's not an irreligious person. She's actually a very devout person. She's a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to give heed to what was said by Paul. When she was baptized with her household. Sometimes people say, why in the world would you baptize infants and children? But from the very, very beginning, you have this precedent that people are converted and their whole household gets baptized. She besought us, saying, if you judge me to be faithful, Lord, come to my house and stay. And she prevailed upon us. Her house is pretty interesting. She's got to have one of the nicer houses in Philippi. And by the end of the story, one of the things we learn is that the church in Philippi, there weren't any church buildings, right? So where did people meet? They met in someone's home. You could meet in the smallest home out of the people that were in your group, but probably you would meet in a larger home if you could, especially if the church was growing. So it turns out that Lydia's home is the first church in Philippi. And one of the things that I would suggest about that, this isn't documented, it's pretty interesting, is that Christianity alone, among any activity in the ancient world, cut across social barriers. In everything else, social barriers were affirmed, they were accepted, they were acknowledged. That's just the way it is. You have rich people and they hang out with other rich people, and poor people hang out with other poor people. Christianity would come into a city, and one of the things that was upsetting about it is that you would have rich and poor. You would have landed people and homeless people, and they were all kind of in one group. And the book of Acts tells us that they were really intent on taking care of each other. They wanted to ensure, as Acts 4 puts it, that there was not anyone poor among them. So this is actually pretty interesting. If the church building is a wealthy person's home, what that means is that there are poor people coming into the wealthier neighborhoods, right? And the activity of caring for the homeless and the poor would be happening where? In a wealthy person's home. I don't know how to translate that into sort of Charlotte talk in 2015, but it's intriguing to think about, an affluent, gated neighborhood, but you're opening it up to, sort of the riffraff of Charlotte and the clinic, the shelter, the food closet, the clothing closet is in your home. And what do the neighbors think, right? And the neighbors are either appalled or they're kind of impressed by this, right? Because one of the reasons that people come around to Christianity in the early years is not because, and we hear this over and over from critics of Christianity, they don't say they have better ideas, they have cool ideas. What they say is, see how those people love each other, right? They're just amazed by that. The next interesting thing that happens in Acts 16, I love this little incident. It says that as we were going to the place of prayer, we were met by a slave girl who had a spirit of divination. And the Greek translated there is she was a pythoness, like a python, a serpent, a pythoness. She was a pythoness. You think, well, what is that? Well, what it is that back in those days, if you wanted to divine the future, if you wanted to know, should I go to battle or not? Should I buy this company or not? Should I marry her or not? You wanted to know the will of the gods. And they did all kinds of things, right? They would read livers. They would watch the course of birds flying through the air. They did crazy things to try to figure out God's will. The greatest place to learn about God's will was the oracle at Delphi. And up in the mountains of Greece, there's the city of Delphi. That's a photo of it on the right. Lisa and I got to go there a number of years ago. And you go to the oracle at Delphi. And what happened in the oracle of Delphi is they had women who were slaves, and they were called pythonesses, right? Because if you think about the serpent image, we tend to think of the serpent image as being, like you're scared of snakes, but doctors, you have like the serpent symbol for healing and all this. So a lot of good things in the ancient world were associated with serpents, and the python was a symbol of sort of extraordinary, mystifying knowledge. So all these slave girls were there, and this has all been documented. It always sounds crazy when I describe this to people. They would burn leaves and create this hallucinogenic smoke. They were basically getting high, if you will. And the women would smell the smoke, and people would come to them and say, should I go to war or not? And they would say something that made no sense whatsoever. as people under the influence are inclined to do, right? And then someone standing by would interpret what she had said. They'd say, what that means, because no one could understand it, is you shouldn't go to war. How they did that, we don't know. But they made a lot of money doing this. So somebody got the brilliant idea that not everybody could get to Delphi, so we'll have branch establishments in the cities of the ancient world. So Philippi had a branch establishment. There was this slave girl there, and she is an extension of the oracle at Delphi, and people paid money. She would sniff the smoke, and she would tell them what God's will is. We were met by a slave girl who had a spirit of divination, a pythoness, and brought her owners much gain by her soothsaying. So these guys are walking around, they're making money off her, right? This is amazing. She followed Paul and us crying, "These men are servants of the Most High God who proclaim to you the way of salvation." I mean, that's hilarious, isn't it? Right? When Jesus is walking around, like, who knows who he is? Yes, thank you, John. That's crazy people, but even beyond that, the demons in the crazy people speak through the crazy people. They know who Jesus is. Like, they're aware they're in the isn't that interesting? They're aware they're in the presence of real power that actually might imperil them. Pretty interesting. These men are servants who proclaim to you the way of salvation. This she did for many days. But Paul was annoyed. I just think that's cool, right? Like, this good thing is happening, but she does it over and over, and it gets on Paul's nerves, right? Which makes sense, right? If somebody followed you around every day and said, "Walter, you're just the coolest," like, you'd like that at first, but day after day, where are you at? Paul gets annoyed. So he turns and says to the spirit in her, for Paul, see, people in Philippi would have thought she was in a good way possessed by the spirit of Apollo to tell them the truth. But Paul understood that she was possessed by something that was negative, that was harmful. So Paul turns and says to the spirit in her, "I charge you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her." And it came out of her that very hour. So she's healed. Now, but when her owners saw that their hope of gain was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace before the rulers. When they had brought them to the magistrates, they said, "These men are Jews, and they are disturbing our city." It's not like everybody doesn't get excited when there's a healing, do they? Right? They're disturbing our city. They advocate customs which it is not lawful for us Romans to accept or practice. The crowds joined in attacking them, and they get thrown into prison. Isn't it interesting? Over and over in these stories in Acts, what drives the theological conversation is money. And this is a cautionary tale to us in the year 2015, right? Because if the people of God do something that's going to cost somebody some money, we suspect it's not really of God. When actually God's probably calling us to do something that may well cause us, probably will cause us to have less money, right? If we live in a society that is out of sync with God, if we live in a society that's obsessed with money and what money can buy, then money's the real idol in our culture. So if God really speaks to our culture, there may actually be less money for the people of God, not more money for the people of God. But we back off at this, right? Because let's say we made a decision here about the church that said we're going to follow God's will, and that's going to result in us having half as much money next year as we had this year. People say, "You are misreading God's will." Guy, right? You know what I'm saying? So anything we get that backwards, don't we? And then you have the amazing scene, of course, Paul and Silas are in jail, and it's so cool. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying. I've not been to Philippi, but there's an old stone Roman jail from the first century that they show you. So this comes off as the prison of Paul and Silas. And it says, about midnight, Paul and Silas were what? Praying and singing hymns to God. I mean, prison life in those days had to be just abject. Dark, cold, they beat the daylights out of you, they didn't give you any food, you didn't have any rights or anything. It was horrible. And they're singing hymns to God at midnight, which says something about them. Then there's the earthquake, and the jail door is open, and the jailer sees them. He's going to kill himself because he's lost the prisoners, but they haven't run off, and he converts. It's amazing, just amazing. And he's baptized with his household. So again, here he converts, but you have wife, children who are baptized at the same time. The journey moves on. I spent too much time on that, but it's a fascinating story, isn't it? So in that one city of Philippi, I just love that set of stories. everybody's becoming part of this Jesus movement, right? You have the wealthy woman, you have the slave girl, a riot is touched off, and you have the jailer who'd kind of be a middle-class kind of guy. So this church in Philippi is pretty interesting, because before those days, jailers wouldn't have hung out with slave girls or with wealthy women. But after that, they have a church in Lydias House where all those people and others are together. It's amazing. It's a social revolution. It's not just people having pious thoughts and getting a ticket into heaven, right? This early Christianity is a social revolution. We'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. Paul travels on from Philippi and goes south. He comes next to Thessalonica. Today that's called Thessaloniki. You know our associate Ashley Douglas, who works with us. She taught English in Thessaloniki for a couple of years after she got out of school, so she knows that place really well. And this is another place. They go to Thessalonica. You know, a riot is touched off. There's all kinds of, everybody's upset. And I love the line in Acts 17, verse 6. The complaint. The Christians get dragged before the authorities. And here's the complaint that's filed. These men who have turned the world upside down have come here also. And Jason has received them. This guy Jason had them come to his home. And they are still acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus. We miss this all the time because we have our pious language. Like people say, Jesus is Lord. And that sounds like a very pious thing to say. In the ancient world, you could get your throat cut for saying Jesus is Lord. And the reason is, who was Lord? Caesar. That, in every city, there were temples that were erected to the worship of the Caesar. And the chant you were to give is, Caesar is Lord. Who else could be Lord? Of course, it's the Caesar. So when the Christians said, Jesus is Lord, they looked stupid. They looked subversive. They looked like, that sounded like treason. It cost them, we'll say more about that. It cost them business deals. We'll say more about that. So they leave Thessaloniki and they come down through Berea. I read that phrase. So the emperor thing is pretty interesting because on all the coin, you know, they hand Jesus the coin and he does the render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. And we miss that, don't we? We say separation of church and state. And this is not at all what Jesus has in mind. They hand him a coin, and it has a blasphemous image on it. It has an image of the Caesar, and what the coin says is that the Caesar, I don't know if you can see the word here, D-I-V-U-S. That means the Caesar is divine. The Caesar is God. So you hand Jesus this coin, and Jesus knows that Caesar isn't divine, so he's basically saying, well, give Caesar what's his. I don't want any part of that untruth, that blasphemy. I'm here to serve the true living God. I am that God in the flesh. All the cities were dominated by these temples. This is a temple to the Caesar in Pergamum, where our Turkey group is going to visit, the ruins of that. All the language around the emperor is the emperor is divus, divine. The emperor is dominus, Lord. The emperor is soter, Savior. When we say Jesus is Savior, we just think, oh, he died for our sins, go to heaven. But the emperor in those days was called the Savior, right? He would save the people from their troubles. He would save the people from famine and drought. He would save the people from attacking armies. To say Jesus is Savior, totally subversive. And everything that they told, if you told the story about how cool the emperor was, they called that the euangelion, the good news, the gospel. Our word translated gospel is the word that would have been used for the stories that were told about the Roman emperor. It's cool. Paul comes to Athens, and here he doesn't have a Jewish audience there at all. He comes, a lot of people have been to the Parthenon in Athens. The photo up to the left, that's the Areopagus. That's the Mars Hill, if you will. It's where the Council of War was taken. So the Athenian leaders would always gather up there, and they would decide whether to go to war. They would divine if the god Mars was behind them in their war. Paul goes up there and preaches a really remarkable sermon, and some people are interested, and some don't want to have much to do with it. Next thing, Paul goes to Corinth, heading south. Corinth is a very affluent city because of the isthmus. That's just such a fun word to say, right? Isthmus. These two seas are joined there so they can haul ships across there. It was very valuable in the trade routes in those days. All the cultures of the world came there, so there were temples there to all of the gods east and west of there. It was a religious hotbed. But this early church forms there, and Paul writes letters to them, and there's a paving stone. Lisa and I got to see this. We got to go to Corinth a few years ago. And it says here that Erastus paved this street that you see there at his own expense. And this is what happened in the ancient world, right? They didn't have governments to raise taxes to do things like build a road. So if you build a road, I'd go to Danny, who's really wealthy, and say, Danny, we need a new road. Danny said, I'll build the road. He's a big dog. And you'd get a paving stone. So Danny built the road. Erastus built this road. Well, what's interesting is that we know from Paul's letters that this Erastus is one of the Christians in the church in Corinth. So here again, you see the shattering of social boundaries, because most of the Christians in Corinth would have been very poor, slave, house worker people. But then there's Erastus, who's prominent enough to be able to build a street and get his name put on it. Paul comes to Corinth, and he stays there for a good while. He's tried while he's there before the proconsul, whose name is Gallio. And what's cool about this, this is the bema, the trial seat where Gallio would have sat in judgment of Paul in Corinth. And sometimes it's hard to date what Paul did when, but we know that Gallio was the proconsul in Corinth in the year 52 AD. So we know that's when Paul was there. So then everything else hangs on that for the chronology, which is kind of cool. Of course, Paul writes letters back to all of these churches, and it's really to the church at Corinth that his theology becomes really wise, where he begins to talk about the crucifixion of Jesus and how the foolishness of God. I mean, Paul's going around the world where there's a culture of success, where there's a culture of the high and mighty, where there's a culture of wealth, and everyone's on this upwardly mobile ladder, and Paul's gospel is the antithesis of this. He talks about a very, very poor man who died a despicable death, and that's the way to life, not the other way. Just how radical that is. Paul calls this, when he writes to the Corinthians, the foolishness of God. So Paul winds up the second journey. I'll be done pretty soon. He goes back to Caesarea on the sea, which is a big city that Herod had built up. On the left, you can see a photo I took there of what it looks like today. On the right, it's an artist's depiction. Herod like the Romans weren't impressed by nature. Whatever nature had left, the Romans said, we're going to redirect nature. So they create rivers where there weren't rivers. They create harbors where there weren't harbors. And Herod had done this at Caesarea Philippi, at Caesarea by the sea. So then Paul embarks on his third missionary journey. Not surprisingly, he retraces his steps through Asia Minor, visits the churches that he went to before. He goes back through Greece, revisits those churches, and then he stops for a long time in the city of Ephesus. That's my daughter Grace, years ago in Ephesus, at the library there, and here we are. I look so young there, don't I? It's cool. That's the theater in Ephesus. And Acts 19 tells us this interesting thing. It says that Paul taught at the lecture hall of Tyrannus. They've excavated all of Ephesus, and they can't figure out where that lecture hall was. They think they know, but they can't know for sure. There's some early translations of Acts that add the following, and this is a copy of the manuscript, where it says that Paul taught there from the 5th hour to the 10th hour. So that would have been from 11 o'clock until 4 o'clock. That's kind of interesting, right? So what that probably indicates, if that's right, is that Paul worked. He's a tent maker. He's in the canvas fabric business. He'd worked from the time he got up until 11 o'clock, and then the rest of the day he would talk in this lecture hall to people about Christianity. So it's not like he preached one sermon. They're talking for hours every day. That's fascinating. And what can you do if you talk hours every day? Like, you can explore a lot of stuff, you can answer a lot of questions, you can explore a lot of what does this mean for this, if Jesus is Lord, what does it mean for that? Pretty interesting. They're going really in depth on things. So it's not that Paul comes into town and says, Jesus is Lord, and they say, I believe it, and they're done. They've spent some time, and they've gone pretty deep with all of this stuff. It's fascinating, isn't it? So one of the most fascinating things in Ephesus is, one of the wonders of the ancient world was the Temple of Artemis, Artemis, in Ephesus. This is what remains of that wonder of the world. My group going will see this. There's one really lonely column there. They must have stood taller as other temples to Artemis did. This is one in the country of Jordan. There's a park in the city of Istanbul where they've created a life-size replica of the Temple of Artemis. It's pretty amazing. It's pretty impressive. It's huge, by the way. The Temple of Artemis was 3.5 times as large as the Parthenon. We think about the Parthenon being a significantly sized. This place was huge. It was gleaming. And, of course, it's dedicated to the goddess Artemis. And this is what statues of Artemis look like. And children and adults blush over this. They think, oh, my goodness. And what does this mean? Well, Artemis is the Roman goddess name is Diana, right? And she's the goddess of the hunt. She's the goddess of fertility. She's a goddess of war. So this symbolism, so people look at that and they think, oh, those are breasts. But if you look here, there are bulls here. This is sort of the dominant image throughout ancient Near Eastern religion. Bulls. In Egypt, you have golden bulls. The bull connotes what? Strength, potency, virility, all the good things you want out of government, right? And out of your gods. They think that these are bull testicles, if you will. So that'd be like symbols of immense power. And what happens in Ephesus, and it's just a hilarious story, is it's long. I hate to read the whole thing. What happens is Paul comes to Ephesus, and people start being converted to Christianity. And again, in the olden days, you could believe in Artemis and you could believe in any other god that happened to come to town. That was fine. It was additive. But the Christians come and say, you got to put away your old gods. And so people stop worshiping Artemis. And there are a number of implications of this for them. In the ancient world, the temples were also the banks and the stock market, if you will. That's not the right term, but it's sort of where business was done in the temple. So if you didn't worship Artemis anymore, you wouldn't go to her temple, which would mean you couldn't do banking and you couldn't do business deals, because business deals were always done over food that was sacrificed to the goddess in the temple. So becoming a Christian, that was like, it was a change of life. And but people are converting anyway because they're really buying into this Jesus thing. And so what happens in Ephesus, read the whole story in Acts 19, it's really hilarious. You have silversmiths, they're there today. When you go to Ephesus, you can buy little images of the goddess Artemis, right? Souvenir hawkers, they're selling them to you. That happened in the ancient world. So people made these and they sold them to people. What happens if people start being converted to Christianity? They don't believe in Artemis any longer. They stop buying the silversmiths' little trinkets. Again, money driving the theological conversation. So a riot breaks out of the street and Paul gets driven out of town because he's evil, because he's damaging the economy. So fascinating the way this plays out. During the time that Paul's in Ephesus, he writes a lot of his letters to various other churches that he's visited. He also does another pretty interesting thing there. He sends somebody named Epaphras to found a church in Hieropolis, which is one of the places our group in Turkey is going to go. They have these amazing, they have these hot water baths there that are incredible. And then the crystals from the flowing water coming up out of the earth form these just amazing white terraces. It's just a stunning place. So Paul sends Hierapolis, who founds a church there. We can read about that in Colossians chapter 4. He sends Epaphras, who forms a church in Laodicea. In a month, I'm going to do a class on the book of Revelation, and the church at Laodicea is called, they're accused of being lukewarm. We'll talk about that next month and what that picture means. One of the things that Paul is doing in this entire missionary journey is he's learned that there is a famine and there is immense poverty back in Jerusalem. So traveling all over the world, what he does is he raises money for the Christians back in Jerusalem. Now to us, that seems fairly normal. We have love offerings for various people, various places. In the ancient world in those days, people did not send money to other places to help people in need, ever. That was unheard of. So this very fact of collecting money for strangers you'd never met, that had never happened in the world before. It was unheard of. And think how remarkable it is that Paul did that for the Christians in Jerusalem, because when he last left the Christians in Jerusalem, what was the deal? They were thinking he might not be that cool because he's reaching out to Gentiles. We're not sure about these Gentiles being part of the church. We think you have to be Jewish and stick around Jerusalem like Jews have always done. They hit hard times. What does Paul do? He brings money from the Gentile Christians for their relief. I mean, it's an extraordinary act of love and hope and faith. It's really amazing. Paul's in Jerusalem, and you read all of this, the latter 20 and following, the book of Acts. He gets accused of bringing a Gentile into the temple. I don't know if Paul did that or not. He may have. He's the kind of guy who might have done that, right, to push the envelope. He gets arrested, and they haul him off to Caesarea. This is a group I took to Caesarea a couple of years ago. He's tried there in Caesarea, and then he's shipped off to Rome, and that takes forever on the ship because they have shipwreck. They get stuck for weeks. It takes a long time. He finally gets to Rome, and he lives there for a number of years under house arrest. And one of the things they've always asked is, where did Paul live? I was lucky enough to be in Rome a few years ago with a guy who knows probably more about Paul than anybody in the world. And he showed me a really obscure church in Rome that nobody goes to. And well, some people go there on Sunday, but they don't go there as tourists. And lo and behold, in the crypt of this church, the priest there showed me these stone cavities. And archaeologists have studied these, and what they believe, they're very near the river in Rome, and it's very near the Jewish quarter in Rome to this day. And they believe that this is where the tanners of ancient Rome would soak their canvases before they hung them up to dry. And you start to think, well, the tanners in Rome lived in a very small area. Paul's a tanner. He lived under house arrest. Paul had to have lived like here, near here. Really intriguing. And so then years later, they built a church on top of it. Now, this is back 1,000 years ago, called St. Paul. Well, for a long time, people said, well, that can't have been where St. Paul was. But it probably actually is where St. Paul was. That's kind of cool, I think. I love obscure things. Then Paul is put in prison. Here are the steps down to the traditional prison, the Mamertine prison. He's put there by Nero, who's he's a great emperor at first, and then he just goes absolutely insane. And he persecutes all kinds of people, especially the Christians. And there's the famous story about he was having a garden party, and it was too dark, and so he took some Christian slaves and had them tarred and then had them lit to be torches to light up his garden. Paul. During this time that Paul's in prison, he writes the last letters of his life, Philippians, Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon. And I would argue that they seem more mature. They seem wiser. He's near death. He seems to be aware that he's near death. He dies in Rome, and we don't know when. There's a church on the outskirts of Rome called St. Paul outside the walls. There's a sarcophagus there that traditionally has said it contains the bones of Paul. Nobody knows that, but there's a movement now to try to get that dug up and tested. You wonder if that's a great idea or not. So that's kind of the life of Paul. It ends here in Rome, but his influence is extended to the point that we're in this room today talking about him, talking about his theology and what it means to us. And I'll come back a month from tonight and look at the book of Revelation, which is pretty interesting. It involves some of these same cities that Paul visited and also some crazy visions about the end of time and what God ultimately will do. It's pretty fascinating. A lot of people use this, of course, to predict things going on in our day. We'll talk about Revelation in a month. So it's not quite time for the Carolina State game. And I talked longer than I meant to, but I wanted to cover all this. Are there questions you have, anything that you wonder about or want to talk about? Something wasn't clear we want to think more about?
What was the ailment that Paul suffered from?
Well, good doctor question. Thank you. What was the ailment, Dr. Beard, thank you, that Paul suffered under? And I assume you're alluding to, Paul says this thing in 2 Corinthians where he says, I had this thorn in my side. I asked God to remove it, but God didn't remove it. I would assume that if Paul's like everybody else in the ancient world, he suffered from what we would count today as all kinds of maladies. If you think about it, people in the ancient world had tooth decay, I mean, you name it, right? Things that would just do us in today. Everybody had it routinely. Paul's pretty lucky, actually. Life expectancy in those days for a man was like 30. So it's interesting. Jesus dies at about age 30, we think. But many people died by age 30. So Paul makes it, we don't know, he's got to be in his 60s when he dies, we would guess. But the thorn in the side, and Paul never explains that, and we don't know what that is. Is it a physical ailment? Is it some spiritual issue that he couldn't resolve? Was it a broken, unhealed relationship that he referred? And sort of the beauty of that, I think, is that he didn't, let's say it was arthritis. Well, then all arthritis sufferers would say, oh yeah, Paul's our guy. But since it's left open-ended, then everybody can enter into it. Like, you have your own thorn in your side, right? And God doesn't heal everything. And that's where Paul says the thing about strength is perfected in weakness. We think weakness is bad, but Paul says weakness is good. The fact that this isn't healed isn't a sign that there's not a God, but it's actually the way God has worked in and through me is through my weakness, through my unhealedness. Is that a word? The Bible does us that favor often, actually, where it doesn't over-define things so everybody can enter into it. Like when Jacob wrestles with the angel, with whoever it is during the night, what is that? And it's cool. Whatever your dark wrestling is, you can enter into that, which is good. So the answer to your question is, I don't know. Yes, Tom.
The time frame for these journeys and travels, how many years did it take Paul to do these journeys and travels over
Some people, there's some pretty precise chronologies around that. I'm trying to think. Each journey, we know pretty much exactly how long it took. So the last missionary journey takes a long time, but largely that's because Paul parked in Ephesus for 3 years. He's in Achaia. He goes to the house of somebody named Gaius, where he stays for 3 months. So he spends a lot of time not moving around. And then he's moving around. It's at a slow pace, but it's not at a snail's pace, right? So you walk however many miles in a day, and you're sleeping out of doors. But each of the trips is, a year or more in duration. So Paul's on the road most of his adult life, if you think about it, which is pretty interesting. And it says a lot about what he believed and his care for other people, right? A lot of times, I think, some evangelists come off as kind of heavy-handed, and they're sort of, they look down on people who don't agree with them or believe what they believe. But at some point, there's got to be an immense amount of love to want to go to such difficulty to reach people and to care for them and have something that you're excited enough about that you'll go to that difficulty and your bodily risk. Paul's thrown in jail. He's beaten a bunch of times, shipwreck, everything. I mean, this is profoundly difficult for him to do. But he's so zealous for it. And it's interesting. He's not going to a world where there are a bunch of believers, like when Billy Graham would do crusades. I mean, there were some Christians somewhere, right? You could call the local churches to give you support when you get there. Paul was going into hostile cities, right? There was hostility everywhere, and you didn't have like a home base. And his home base, in some places, would have been and could have been Judaism. There were synagogues in some of these places. Jesus, when he would go to a city, he would always start at the synagogue. Paul would always start at the synagogue, but as we read over and over in the letters and in the book of Acts, a lot of times he goes to the synagogue first, and those are the people who really want to throw him out of town, right? So the people that should be, because the Jews were the other people, by the way, in the ancient world who said there's only one true religion. The Jews were the only other people in the world who said there's only one true God. The God of the Jews was the same God of the Christians, right? Those aren't like separate somehow. But that's where Paul met a lot of his hostility. What else?
On his sea travels, who commissioned the boat, so to speak, and who was with him on the boat?
Yeah, so there were, we know a good bit about this. I have a friend who teaches up at Davidson College. He's quite the expert on like Roman boats and what they looked like. So there are people, they just did this for a living. They hung out in the various ports, and you would pay a fare to ride on a boat or to commandeer a boat, and it was risky. They had their crew. Paul's always got a small little entourage traveling with him. Even when he's arrested, it's actually interesting. If you read in Acts 19 and 20, when he's arrested in Rome for bringing a Gentile into the temple, Felix says he's got to go to Caesarea under house arrest. They send 146 soldiers with him. Like, he's just a guy, right? But there's some fear of this burgeoning Christian movement. It's really small, though, for a long time, and you have to know this. I've got statistics on it somewhere. After, I forget what it is, something like 100 years after Jesus' death, the percentage of Christians in the population was still less than 1%. By 200 years later, it was 60% of the population. I mean, they got busy, right? And they did really well. But it's small incremental growth year after year. So there weren't many Christians. The average person in the world would not have known a Christian. Yeah. What else? Yes, Sarah.
But why Paul in particular for so many writings to be included in the Bible? Is it because he was so diligent in some of his travels? Was there no one else, I guess, that was similar in how much traveling they were doing and how much they were trying to spread Christianity?
Yeah, I mean, there are other letters in the New Testament that are early. So like the letters of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John and 1st and 2nd Peter. You have a few others. There had to be a lot of letters that were flying around. Paul had to have written letters we don't know. We know that, actually. Paul refers to letters that are not in the Bible. That's kind of cool, isn't it? You get hold of those. So Paul's writing. One of the things, though, that I read something about this recently. I hadn't really thought about it this way. Paul almost had a brand or an enterprise in the ancient world. If you think about it, he didn't just visit cities. but he had delegates who he would send there. He would write letters to those. He was pretty deliberately forming, right, a group of churches. He wasn't just founding a church and then just another church and this another church, or a convert and another convert and another convert. He was really kind of building a brand everywhere that he traveled. He expected that those people would be in contact with each other. So one of the things that came out of that is as he wrote letters to these communities, this guy Richard Balcom that I mentioned, he believes very early on they thought it was important to share those letters with each other and that they would bind them up and everybody would read everybody else's letters. And then you even have a letter like Ephesians, and we think, oh, that was written to the people in Ephesus. There's nothing in that letter about Ephesus. Right? When Paul writes to the Corinthians, he's talking about the people in Corinth who were causing trouble. There's nothing in Ephesus about Ephesus. And so the best theory is Paul was in Ephesus, and he wrote a letter to be circulated among all of the churches sort of in his sphere of authority. So that's one of the reasons probably why those letters lived long, because Paul had a pretty good strategy about how to reach people. You know, you hear about Philip going off to Egypt or wherever, but nothing stuck there in that way. So you don't have a letter of Philip. You don't have a letter of, you do get a letter of James, but that's sort of an oddity there. Anyway, we don't really know. Yes, John.
Is that a similar model to where his rabbi that he was, is that, would rabbis have done something similar so he kind of learned that from Gamaliel or Hillel or whoever?
Gamaliel. Rabbis, it's hard to say. Rabbis didn't found communities so much as they had disciples who themselves became teachers, and some would stay where they were in a school in that city, and some would go to other teachers who would become the chief rabbi there. They weren't forming communities so much as they just were Jewish teachers for whatever Jews there were. They weren't trying to form new Jewish communities anywhere, right? Yes.
Consistent with your thought that he was building a brand, isn't there a letter where Paul says, if you get any letters from anybody else, don't believe them? And in fact, if you get another letter from me, don't believe them, because somebody else might be writing his name. After all, what did Paul look like? And he says, what my handwriting looks like, make sure that you stick to me. You don't believe anybody else.
Yeah, and the reason for that is, and that's one of the things that James Tabor will have a point with me tomorrow, and I won't be able to defeat him on that. I don't want to defeat him. I just want to talk to him. Is that, why Paul's way instead of some of the other teachers' way? And there are a lot of ways to think that, right? Either Paul just won and the others were defeated. Maybe they had better ideas. You could say God guided the process, so Paul won because that's what God wanted to come out of it. Paul is aware that in early Christian truth is a pretty fragile thing today, right? Anybody can say anything, especially with the internet. Oh my gosh, you can Google anything and something will turn up. There's just all kinds of stuff out there. So how do you know what to trust, what not to trust? It was really fragile in the earliest days of Christianity. There were no seminaries. There were no theological books that had been published. There were just people wandering around saying, here's the significance of Jesus. Who do you believe? Who do you not believe? And so Paul knew how fragile that was. Paul really believed the other people hadn't had the kind of revelation that he'd had, and that he had really understood the heart of what Jesus had been about and what the extension of Jesus should have been. And we could argue all day that he was wrong, and there would have been some better ideas. The way I always think about this, and I can't prove this to anybody who doesn't agree, is that, I think how to put it, over time, truth has a way of being found out, and less adequate versions of the truth expose themselves, right? So if I said to you, this would be really popular, and actually is popular with many people. If you just believe in Jesus, you'll be healthy, wealthy, and wise. And people are like, dang, give him a raise. See, it's working, right? And the problem is that doesn't actually work over time, does it? Because people who believe in Jesus very profoundly, and they get sick and they die, and they lose their jobs, and they lose their houses, and their husbands beat them, and terrible things happen. That doesn't actually work. So what is a theology that actually works? As it turns out, there's some weirdness in Paul. But on the whole, the heart of Paul's theology, this is my view, really works. That's an overly simplistic way. but it deals with everything well. It deals with simple things like things are going well for you and whatever. And Paul can say things in Philippians like, if there's any excellence, think on these things, be grateful, rejoice. Paul can take that into account. But Paul can take the worst suffering into account and make sense of it and bring hope out of it. And so to me, his theology actually really works. His theology, in my view, is the best possible and only full way of fleshing out what Jesus was about when he was here. Others had competing views, but I would say those takes weren't as good, weren't as adequate to help people with the range of things that we have to deal with. I can't prove that, but I think that that's right. I think in early Christianity, you have the Da Vinci Code and all these books that sell so many copies in the bookstores. And, they all say that sort of Christian orthodoxy is this evil thing that got foisted on the public by mean people. I just couldn't disagree more. I believe Orthodox Christianity actually, it's true. And it's not true because somebody said it was true at a council. That's not why it's true. It's true because it's actually worked for all kinds of people in all kinds of cultures. And that's the interesting part. Is that Christianity has worked for people in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's worked for people in Brazil, and it's worked for people in China, and it's worked people. So you have like determined communists in China, they become Christians, and they really believe this stuff. You have these stories, it's such different kinds of people find that it actually works. I wonder if it doesn't actually speak to the human condition in the most powerful possible way. So I'm rambling on why Paul. So, anything else?
Well, with all of that, we still talking about him.
It's pretty amazing. But then there's humbling stuff too. The first time I took a group to Turkey, we're traveling around all these places where Paul went, and somebody said, "Where are the churches?" And they're not there. There are some churches in Turkey, but not many. It's a Muslim country, but it's a secular Muslim country, so you needn't associate it with the kind of Islam that we're seeing on TV and so on. It's an utterly secular country, but it's a Muslim country. There aren't many churches. That would break Paul's heart, I always think, right? That's the vagaries of history. Yeah. So, all right, I'm going to call time. It's a little warm in this room. I don't know why. Sorry about that. You're really kind to come out tonight. It's cold and everything. I appreciate you being here and thinking together. If later... If later you think of a question or just something you wonder about, email me or call me. I love to talk about Bible things every time I can. So thank you for coming.